Good evening, and thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event. Welcome to any new people this week. We also have people watching on Facebook and some who listen to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio at FM 88 in Melbourne or at jair.com.au. Welcome to everyone. My name is Robert Gregory, and I'm hosting tonight's Zoom because I have some direct involvement in some of the issues we're going to be discussing. On the screen is David Adler, President of the AJA, and our guest tonight, Senator James Paterson. The format will be as usual, interview style, and then questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, the best way is to raise your hand in the reaction button, and written questions can also be placed on the chat function, and we'll try to keep an eye out for those. So many of you will be familiar with Senator James Paterson. He's a rising star in the Liberal Party and a strong friend of Israel and the AJA. This is his second appearance on an AJA Weekly Zoom. James has been a Liberal Party senator representing Victoria since 2016. And since his election, he's been generating waves. He was denied entry to China for standing up for the Uyghurs, which is something AJA has been very outspoken about. In 2021, he was appointed chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence, and he's been instrumental in prescribing terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. Since the last election, James has been the shadow minister for countering foreign interference and cybersecurity. So Senator Paterson, thank you for joining us.
Robert, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And good to see you, David, and all my friends at the Australian Jewish Association. As you know, I love your work and appreciate your advocacy.
Thank you. Well, let's get straight into it. What is the major geopolitical threat, the largest geopolitical threat to Australia today? And do you think the government is doing enough to combat it?
The short answer to that is the Chinese Communist Party and its ambitions for the world. And the long answer to that is that Sir Angus Houston, one of the expert reviewers doing the Defence Strategic Review and a former chief of the Defence Force, who's a very mild-mannered person and a very measured person, said at the press conference announcing the DSR that Australia is living in the most dangerous times in his lifetime. He's a man and he's well into his 70s, and that's a very significant statement for him to make, and unfortunately one that I share. China's a growing country and no one in Australia objects to that. In fact, we have all prospered very much from that. We've benefited greatly from China's growth. But unfortunately, with China's growth has come a real growth in its assertiveness and aggression to the region and to the world. And the Chinese Communist Party is a paranoid political organisation that is fearful of its own survival and thinks that it needs to remake the world order in order to make it safe for dictatorships like its own. And as part of that, it believes it needs to dominate not just its immediate borders and its immediate region, but at least the Indo-Pacific, if not the world. And it is teaming up with its friends and allies around the world, including Russia and Iran and North Korea, to try and make the world safe for autocracies. That would be terrible for a liberal democracy like Australia. We are very much threatened by a rising and assertive China, and particularly one that seeks to change the world order with its might and with its size, and is willing to threaten to use force, and I fear one day actually use force to do that in the case of the Taiwan Straits and potentially the East China Sea and the South China Sea as well. So are we doing enough for it? The short answer is not yet. And that's not a partisan statement. I felt that when we're in government, we were doing lots, but it wasn't enough either because of the nature of the threat we face and because of the slowness of our political system to accept the reality of that threat and to respond to it adequately. I'm very proud of the national security legacy of the former government, restoring defence spending to 2% of GDP, securing AUKUS, and the many other important things we did to stand up for Australia. But all of that needs to be not just continued by the new government, but actually significantly accelerated. I hope they can build upon what we did and really accelerate it. I sometimes say that, you know, as a partisan, I hope this Labor government makes lots of mistakes, provides lots of political opportunities for the opposition to come back, but I genuinely hope they make absolutely no mistakes at all when it comes to national security and defence, because the circumstances for our country are just so dire. And in my view, nothing less than whether or not we hand over a sovereign liberal democracy to our children and grandchildren is what is at stake.
Wow.
David?
James, you've been a supporter of Israel, I know, and actually the very first social media message I saw of yours was very early on in your political career. You posted a picture of yourself in Jerusalem saying you were looking for a site for the Australian embassy. You remember that one?
I do. It did me greatly to the then foreign minister who didn't share that view.
Well, Israel, of course, is a bit of a powerhouse in defence. I know that the Americans, some of the American senior defence people see Israel almost as a testing ground for various strategies and weapons. Is Australia plugged into that expertise?
Look, Dave, really good question. Just let me briefly recap on the embassy issue, because I think it's important to reflect on that. In my maiden speech in March 2016, I called on the Australian government to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
Good advice.
That was before Donald Trump had been chosen as the Republican nominee, before he'd been elected president, before the United States had moved their embassy there. And I remember people saying at the time, if we do that, then Australia will never sell another bushel of wheat to the Middle East, and it will destroy our relationships with the region. Well, we now know with the benefit of time that with the development of the Abraham Accords and other positive trends in the Middle East, how wrong that was. And I'm greatly disappointed that the Morrison government's decision to recognise Jerusalem and to move for the first time a trade and defence office to Jerusalem, to establish that, a diplomatic presence in Jerusalem, has been and is being reversed by this Albanese government. It was a deeply disappointing thing, and not just the decision, but the appalling way that they handled it. In terms of lessons learned from Israel, there are lots of lessons to be learned by Australia from Israel, because Israel is a country that has not just existed and not just survived, but actually prospered in a very tough neighbourhood. And we are now in a tough neighbourhood in a similar way that Israel's in, although actually Australia is still relatively blessed. We don't have all of our neighbours wanting to wipe us off the map, as Israel has at times in its history. We only have one very significant neighbour in our region who has expansionist objectives. But we are, like Israel, suffering a great disadvantage of population, and our potential adversaries have a much greater population and economic and military weight that comes with that. And so there are some really important lessons to learn from Israel. One is that asymmetric capabilities are really important. That is, capabilities that a small country can use against a large country that can deter them from engaging in conflict. The second is that technology is absolutely key. Small countries cannot compete with larger countries in brute force and raw numbers alone, but they can with technology. And Israel has not just been a pioneer in technology generally, but applying it to military applications. And in my area of responsibility, I particularly admire and follow very closely Israel's very sophisticated cyber both defences and offensive capabilities, which are really world-class and world-leading and way above Israel's size and station in the scheme of things. So we've got to learn from those things. And Australia could do a lot better to integrate the technological development we have and deploying that into the hands of our warfighters, and drawing from Israel the technology they have to make sure we can punch well above our weight.
Okay. Let me ask you something directly onto your shadow portfolio about foreign interference. And I'd like you to comment on it on our universities, James. We've seen, I don't know how many Confucius centres we have in our universities, but in addition,
12.
We have Islamic centres that have been funded by Saudi. We have, and Robert was involved in exposing some of the agreements between Australian universities and Iranian universities. And on the other hand, as you know, the Ramsay Centre has been knocked back when it wants to fund the teaching of Western civilization. So what's going on our, the management of our campuses, and what's the role of government here?
We could have an hour-long discussion alone on the many problems at universities, whether it's kind of the woke politics, whether it's the censorship, whether it's the anti-Semitism. But let's just restrict ourselves to the national security questions that you raised. Yeah. As the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, I recommended that the Foreign Minister exercise her powers under the Foreign Relations Act to cancel the agreements between those universities and the Confucius centres that would have resulted in those coming to an end. The government has recently recently responded to that report and said that while they've told universities they don't want to see any new Confucius centres established, they are not going to exercise their powers under the Act to cancel the existing Confucius Institutes. And the Foreign Minister has not adequately explained why it is acceptable to let Confucius Institutes continue if it's not acceptable to have any new ones. I'm really concerned about that, and you're right to point out some of the background of Middle Eastern themed centres at universities that have been funded by governments that don't share our liberal democratic values. And it really does raise questions as why universities, supposed to be bastions of openness and liberalism and tolerance and education and enlightenment in Western societies, would want to and would be comfortable getting into bed with some pretty odious and authoritarian regimes. Regimes would have been credibly accused of engaging in crimes against humanity and even genocide. I don't think we should have a presence, even if it's just a soft power initiative of the Chinese government, on our university campuses. But of course, there are much more profound concern about Confucius centres than that. And many countries around the world, including the United States and Canada and Europe, have started to close theirs and end their agreements.
Right. And they won't accept funding for teaching Western civilization from the Ramsay Centre. It's like, it's, inverted morality here or something.
That's right. We won't take money from a deceased Australian billionaire because he's a conservative, but we will take money from a current authoritarian regime engaging in crimes against humanity. I mean, it's just, how they can justify that to themselves, I don't know.
Yeah. Robert, over to you.
Yeah, it seems like the only thing not welcome on Australian universities is Israeli speakers. That's the big trade.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the intro, I mentioned your advocacy on behalf of the Uyghurs in China. AJ has been the most outspoken Jewish organization on that. We've had a lot of articles published recently in the Australian. David's spoken at their protest. We've had them guest speakers here, and also submissions to the government. But how would you assess Australia's response so far, and what else can we be doing for them?
Yeah, Robert, I read your article in the Australian a couple of months ago, and I'm really grateful for the AJA's advocacy on that, and more broadly, the Jewish community's engagement in this issue, because there is no community that we should listen to more carefully when it comes to mass human rights atrocities than the Jewish community. We all said collectively, every one of us, after the Holocaust, never again. And we actually have to live up to that promise that we made to the world and make sure it doesn't happen again. And that if anyone does try to attempt anything even approximately like what happened in the Holocaust, that there are very severe consequences for them when they do so. And my judgment is that the Chinese government, other than very serious reputational harm, which has set them back, hasn't really suffered meaningful consequences yet for what they've done in Xinjiang. What we know about Xinjiang is that millions of Uyghurs have been involuntarily interned in concentration-style camps. They've been re-educated, that they have been, medical experiments have been performed on them, that women have been raped, that they have been injected with substances that prevent them from having children, that people have been tortured, that cultural sites significant to Uyghurs, whether it's mosques or cemeteries or other centres in Xinjiang, have been destroyed. That men have been forced to eat pork against their religious beliefs, that they've been forced to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes against their religious beliefs. I mean, this is the systematic destruction of a culture. They prevented the teaching of language and beliefs to future generations to try and sever that cultural link between their parents and their offspring. These are all eerily reminiscent of what regimes of the past have done, not least of which China has done in Tibet. They rolled out a very similar program in Tibet in an attempt to destroy unique Tibetan culture, and they got away with that, and so they feel empowered to do it again in Xinjiang. And one of the ways this directly affects us in the West is that there are many products that are made from slave labour of Uyghur people in China, which is exported and sold in Western countries. We know they've harvested human hair from Uyghurs and tried to sell that in the West. We know that they've been forced to work in factories manufacturing solar panels and precursors for making solar panels, and a whole other range of products. Now, most Western consumers would be utterly horrified to think that they were the beneficiaries of slave labour like that. And yet, as collectively, globally, I don't think we've done enough to enact penalties of that. when this government was in opposition, and we passed a new piece of legislation, the Magnitsky Act, which allows us to sanction human rights abusers directly and personally, the then Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, gave a speech at the University of Tasmania, and she called upon the Morrison government to then consider using those sanctions against the Chinese government and the officials responsible. Now, we didn't do so, and I would have preferred if we had, but I hoped if we'd been re-elected, we would have done so. And so the challenge was recently put to Penny Wong. You called on the government to do it when you were in opposition. Are you going to do it yourself? And the answer has been deafening silence so far. I really hope the government is reconsidering that, and I really hope they take action on it.
Yeah, thank you for your advocacy on that. And yeah, it seems like Penny Wong doesn't really listen to anything unless it's against Israel. But one thing we don't hear so much in the media these days is Islamist terrorism. It used to be a very big story. We have had the ISIS brides return. We've had, I think, Ben Bricker being released, and there was a stabbing in Sydney yesterday. It's suspicious, but it's been said it was mental health reasons. So I wanted to ask, has the threat of Islamist terror diminished, or is it still a major threat in Australia?
I had a very rare piece of good news in national security. It's not normally an uplifting area to work in. It's pretty depressing sometimes when you see the briefings and you contemplate the threats. But we did have a rare piece of good news from ASIO late last year when Mike Burgess, the Director General, lowered the threat level of terrorism in Australia. And that was the first time the terrorism threat level has ever been lowered since it was introduced in the wake of September 11. It has only been up or static since then. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is during the COVID pandemic, there was a rise in what the ASIO Director General termed ideologically motivated violent extremism. That includes people like neo-Nazis and white supremacists, white nationalists and people who traffic in that kind of ideology. There was a big increase in that during the pandemic. Pleasingly, since the end of the pandemic and since the lockdowns and mandates and many of those policies have receded from people's memories, that sort of violent extremism has declined quite significantly. There also has been a decline in Islamist terrorism, particularly post the fall of ISIL. ISIL was a major motivator for radicals and extremists around the world, and young people particularly were being radicalised online by watching the extreme content that was being filmed and broadcast from there around the world. And when that so-called caliphate collapsed, that did undermine one of the important recruiting tools that Islamists use to try and radicalise people. So we are the happy beneficiaries of two positive trends: a decline in ideologically motivated extremism and a decline in religiously motivated extremism. And that's a very positive thing. I don't think it will necessarily always be the case. They are threats that we need to maintain very close watch on, but at the moment they are subsiding, and that's very welcome.
Well, it's good we have some good news. So Russia's war in Ukraine, that's reshaped the geopolitical climate. People are asking, are we in the middle of Cold War II? Is this the start of World War III? What do you see going on in the world?
Look, people are reluctant to use the term Cold War to describe what's happening today for a range of reasons, and it does have kind of historical baggage, and it's certainly not a perfect comparison to what we're having today. But I think there are some analogies that really do hold up, and I think it's the competition, particularly between the United States and China, which most resembles a Cold War style environment. In many ways, Russia is a declining power. It's actually a country in the scheme of things, which, although it's doing serious harm to the people of Ukraine, is a shadow of its former self. To give you one concrete statistic, Russian GDP is now about the same as Australia's GDP. When you think about the outsized impact it has on the world, that's a fairly extraordinary thing. Obviously, its population is much higher, its military spending is a lot higher, and is able to leverage those things quite effectively into geopolitical power. But Vladimir Putin has made a shocking and historic mistake in Ukraine. He has guaranteed that Ukrainians will always want to be free and never rejoin or be part of any kind of greater Russia or restored Soviet Union. He has woken NATO from its slumber and got the Europeans to take their own security much more seriously and invest in it much more seriously, and reinvigorated the alliance between the United States and Europe, which had been under pressure and under stress. And he's done enormous harm to his own military. Thousands of Russian military assets in terms of vehicles have been destroyed. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens and soldiers have been wounded or killed. And the Russian economy has been severely damaged. We think it could be 500,000 or more Russians who have fled and gone overseas. And some of these people are very talented people who were, working in creative industries and technology and earning export income for Russia. That all that talent has now left, and his own position is under more stress and more strain than it has been for a very long time. So, although it has been a terrible episode for the people of Ukraine, in some ways, it is positive that Russia has encountered such fierce resistance and suffered such serious losses, because I think it will temper both their and other authoritarian states like China's ambitions to subjugate their neighbours and others around them.
Well, turning to Israel, the biggest geopolitical threat for them has long been Iran, and it seemed like the world was just letting Iran develop nuclear weapons, but now with the protests in Iran and Iran's involvement in the war in Ukraine, it seems like the world is waking up a bit more to the threat from Iran. As David mentioned, AJ was the only Jewish organization that testified before the Senate, and one of the things we called for was prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and the report that came out upheld those submissions, called for it to be prescribed. The Albanese government hasn't done that. A lot of people are calling them the weakest link in the West when it comes to Iran. Is that accurate? And a related question, how big of a threat are Iranian operatives in Australia? Something that also came out in the committee.
Yeah, look, thank you again for your engagement in this really important issue. And you're absolutely right, David, to mention the work of my friend and my colleague, Senator Claire Chandler, who's done an outstanding job in taking the fight up to the Iranian regime politically here in Australia and putting pressure on the Albanese government to do more. It is extremely concerning, a number of things. One, obviously, the repression of Iranian citizens at home peacefully protesting. That is abominable, and Iran should pay a very heavy price for that. Of course, we know that Iran has for a long time been a destabilising force in the Middle East, that it has been the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East, that its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas and others, have done enormous harm to stability and peace of the world, and particularly to Israel and to Jewish citizens all around the world. And it is long past time that the Iranian regime face the real consequences for that malign conduct and malign behaviour. As you mentioned in the introduction earlier, David, one of my very proud achievements in the Senate is ensuring that both Hamas and Hezbollah are listed entirely as terrorist organisations. Previously, we only listed the military or terrorist wings and maintained this fiction that their political arms were not somehow implicated and involved and morally culpable for their terrorist activities. That changed on my watch as Intelligence Committee Chair and under the Morrison government. But I also strongly agree with your call and Claire Chandler's call to sanction and to list as a terrorist entity the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They are a terrorist organisation in all but name, and it is a time that we recognise that in our legal system and that there be appropriate legal sanctions for people who are involved in assisting their work. The government's argument is that as a state-affiliated entity that they can't be sanctioned. Well, if it's necessary to change our law to do that, then we will support that. That will pass through the parliament in 5 minutes if the government proposes it. No one would argue against that. And there should be consequences for them. To your question about activities of the IRGC in Australia, I am very concerned about this. There have been very credible reports from Iranian dissident communities in Australia that they have been surveilled, that they have been harassed, that they have been coerced, that violent threats have been made against them. And the Home Affairs Minister recently talked about an example of an Iranian cell operating in Australia targeting diaspora communities. That is utterly and totally unacceptable, and there must be very serious penalties for them for doing that. They are flouting our democracy and our sovereignty by thinking that they can behave that way in our country. Iranian Australians, just like any other Australian, have every right to protest what is a very odious regime.
One thing that's been interesting is that how this issue is brought together. I saw even the Greens, even the Teals have been calling to prescribe the IGC, just not the government for some reason. So very interesting.
I completely agree with you. People who are not natural ideological bedfellows or allies of the coalition, or perhaps the AJA, have been quite good on this issue and have called out both the government and the IRGC. And I think it is puzzling that the government is unwilling to do that and that they've moved quite slowly on these issues. really quite a lot of political pressure had to be put on them before they sanctioned anyone under the Magnitsky regime, even though many of our allies and partners had already done so. And many other countries that are aligned to our way of thinking, that are our formal allies in a treaty sense, have already sanctioned the IRGC or put restrictions on them, and we haven't. And it's not clear to me why we haven't.
So, touching on something you mentioned before about moving the embassy and recognizing Jerusalem, some people have been critical of the Morrison government, including AJA, that they didn't go far enough in only recognizing West Jerusalem, and that perhaps by taking this half measure, it was easy to reverse, whereas, for example, Trump's recognition and moving the embassy to Jerusalem was not reversed. So what's your comment on that? And what's the current Liberal Party position on the status of Jerusalem? And in your opinion, does it go far enough?
Well, my view is Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and it is not up to me to determine the exact boundaries of Jerusalem. That is a fact on the ground that'll be resolved by others. But Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and I don't feel the need to put a qualifier on that. And actually, no matter what Australia says or does, or what any other country says or does, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. We can't change that. And all we are doing at the moment under this government is participating in a ridiculous fiction that some other city, not of Israel's own choosing, where its parliament is not located, where its Supreme Court is not located, where its president's house is not located, is in fact its capital. And there's no other country in the world we insult in this way by telling them that we know what their capital city is and it's not the one they've chosen for themselves. There's no other country in the world that isn't able to choose its own capital city within its own boundaries. So we will reverse the government's decision if we are re-elected. We will recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I would like to see the Defence and Trade Office that is there converted into a full and proper embassy, and I'd like to see a permanent Australian diplomatic presence there. I mean, the truth is, as all of you would know, Australian diplomats spend a lot of time in the car from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to engage in all their meetings with Israeli counterparts, because that's where the government of Israel is headquartered, and it is absurd that we don't recognise that appropriately.
So as we mentioned, you did amazing work along with the panel in having Hamas and Hezbollah, the entirety of those terrorist organizations listed as such. Some other organizations that have come up from time to time, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir, do you have any comments about whether they should be? And as well, we've had some communication with foreign governments about the Houthis, this group's calling that they should be listed. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there are a number of groups out there in the community who are quite sophisticated in understanding how our terrorism laws work, and they operate just below the legal thresholds required to be prescribed as a terrorist organisation and dance around that line but don't cross it to avoid the consequences of it. And Hizb ut-Tahrir is one of those organisations. There are very clear legal criteria that you have to meet in order to be qualified as a terrorist organisation. And while they're an organisation which I think is offensive and engages in appalling rhetoric, it doesn't meet the current legal definition of terrorism because they know to stay below that threshold and below that line. And in fact, we see similar behaviour from some neo-Nazi groups in Australia, like the National Socialist Network, that engage in appalling conduct and behaviour, but deliberately keep their behaviour just below that threshold to avoid those consequences. There is an open question as to whether, if that's the case, if people are evading the law and avoiding compliance with the law, whether or not the law should be changed to widen the net, capture more conduct. I'm open-minded about that. There are very serious consequences for being listed as a terrorist organisation, particularly if you're domestically here in Australia. It is a crime to associate with a terrorist organisation and to aid or assist it in any way. So very serious consequences would flow from that. And we have to think carefully through those things. But these groups should not be entertained or sanctified in any way. They are appalling.
Okay. David? No, do you want to go to questions, or have you got another one, Robert?
We'll just ask one more and then we'll go to some audience questions.
Go for it.
So Jim Molan, who sadly passed away recently, was a good friend of AJA, and he was very publicly advocating being prepared for what might happen with China. Do you think Australians are awake to the danger of a war with China, or do you think most people are a bit unaware of what's going on?
I think we've come a long way in the last 5 years. When I first set out on this journey in early 2017 and first threatened to cross the floor against the Turnbull government, who wanted to ratify an extradition treaty with China, which I thought was offensive and very unwise. At that point, the Lowy Institute polling showed that that was the peak of Australian public approval of China. And in fact, public approval of China was only a few points behind America, and public approval of Xi Jinping was only a few points below that of US President Barack Obama. It was only 2 years after we'd secured our free trade agreement. And many thought that the economic relationship was so profound and so positive and so important that everything else in the relationship should take a back seat to that, the human rights and national security concerns. In the last 5 years, that trend has completely reversed. China's public approval in Australia is now only a few points above North Korea, and Xi Jinping's public approval is only a few points above Kim Jong-un's. So there has been a sea change in attitudes in Australia towards China, and I think that's a welcome and sensible thing, because Australians are recognising China for how they are, not for how we imagined they would be. We were innocent and naive about the realities of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, but we have learned about Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet and the South China Sea in a much richer way in the last few years, and that's shifted public opinion. Having said that, I think Jim is right to try and warn Australians about these dangers, and I think his book, which he completed while he was undergoing chemotherapy, which is a fairly amazing thing, he was an amazing person, is a really important book for Australians to read and understand, because it really sets out what the implications would be if China initiated war over the Taiwan Strait and tried to annex Taiwan. Australia is not interested in initiating war with anyone, much less China, but we may be forced to respond to them if they initiate war against others. And what we're trying to do, well, what AUKUS is really about, is preventing that from happening by deterring China from doing it, and hoping that we can make a credible contribution to the alliance effort with the United States and Japan and others to discouraging China from going down that path, because the consequences would be utterly catastrophic. I mean, for a start, 1/3 of our national income, which is derived from our exports of largely raw materials from China, would vanish overnight. There is no way we could continue sending iron ore, gas, coal and other products to China if they were invading their neighbours and subjugating a liberal democracy in Taiwan. And that is just the first of many profound implications that would flow from it that would very seriously affect the world we live in and the living standards of Australians. So it is in our interests to be prepared for that and resilient to that, and hopefully we never have to experience it.
All right, well, if you're listening on Jaya, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we hold every single Wednesday night. And our guest tonight is Senator James Paterson. We're talking about threats to Australia, threats to Israel, and threats to the world. Now, we're just going to quickly hear what's coming up next week. Would you like to say that, David?
Sure. As we do every week, anyone here tonight who is not yet supporting AJA when the event concludes, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can apply for membership. You can make a donation. And I had a message shortly before our event started to remind everyone that there is a mitzvah for Purim to provide some tzedakah, and AJA has to be the first choice where to do that. And there are a couple of donation options via our website. Next week, we're having a look at this extraordinary development in Israel of the mass protests against the government's agenda. What's it about? Who's funding it? And our guest is Ruthie Bloom from the Allgemeine Journal, one of the most direct non-PC commentators, most popular commentators on Middle East matters.
All right, let's go to some questions. Try, as usual, try to keep it as questions, not so many statements. So let's get Jeff first. Jeff, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Greetings, James. I noticed that you were talking with David about the Ramsey Centre, and I put to you that their wonderful funding of Western civilization, which was lacerated by the Labor government and all leftists everywhere, compares with what Israel is doing in all sorts of ways, but particularly annoying is the fact that the Labor government is also supporting the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I wonder, where is the morality in a government purporting to be righteous, in which they lacerate the only decent university organization that's clearly funded Western civilization compared with de facto supporting terrorism?
Well, when we're in government, we very significantly cut funding for a number of aid organisations operating in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip because we were not confident that Australian taxpayers' dollars wasn't going to fund terrorism. And David wrote some pretty impactful articles for The Spectator and ran a great campaign highlighting the risk that Australian taxpayers' money was falling into the hands of terrorist organisations inadvertently. Unfortunately, those cuts have been reversed and that funding has been restored in full, including to UNRWA, and we know the way in which UNRWA funding has been misused in the past, at the very least on extremist material that vilifies Jewish people, let alone the other risks in the way in which they unintentionally or deliberately fund and subsidise terrorist activities. I think it is unconscionable that any Australian taxpayer dollar could fall into the hands of a terrorist or could be used to promote extreme violent propaganda against Jewish people. And I'm disappointed that there's that famous Spectator cover. I remember it very well. I'm disappointed that the government has done that. Unfortunately, I think we're in for a rocky couple of years with this government on Israel. The Labor Party has a stated policy of recognising a Palestinian state, and that necessarily now involves recognising the Hamas regime in Gaza as part of that state, a listed terrorist entity under Australian law. So I really hope the government changes course on that. I think it would be very unwise.
Next question from Anthony. Get to unmute.
Anthony, you need to unmute. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, hi. Senator, I'd very much like to see you in government again very soon.
Thank you.
That was actually my question, which was basically that Hamas has been designated a terrorist organization. I don't understand. Perhaps you can explain why Australian governments keep insisting on a two-state solution, which would mean Israel negotiating with a bunch of terrorists.
Well, my view is it's up to those on the ground who are there dealing with the reality of the situation to negotiate, if they can, the most sustainable and just solution for everybody on the ground. It is not really for Australia to dictate to either the Israelis or the Palestinians what form that should take. I am pessimistic about the prospects for a two-state solution. It would be nice if that is something that could be achieved, if a Palestinian state could exist peacefully beside Israel and would respect and acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. But unfortunately, all the indications we have from the Palestinian leadership, not just Hamas, but Fatah, is that they don't recognise the legitimacy or the right of Israelis to live in peace, and that they will not abandon their objectives of the destruction of the state of Israel, and that they won't give up their support for and their engagement in terrorist activities. And I think until they do that, the prospects of a two-state solution are very bleak indeed. The one positive thing we can identify in the last few years is the way in which the region is changing its attitudes to Israel, despite the failure to resolve the situation between Israel and the Palestinians. I remember the conventional wisdom from everyone, including US governments, John Kerry famously as Secretary of State, where he said that Israel's neighbours would refuse to engage with it until it resolved the peace process with the Palestinians. Well, that has been proven to be profoundly wrong. The Abraham Accords are a wonderful, positive event. And only just recently, we had both Saudi Arabia and Oman agreeing for the first time to allow Israelis to fly through their airspace, which will cut the travel time between Australia and Jerusalem, which is very exciting. Tel Aviv, which is very exciting for Australians. And these are the kind of things that were unimaginable maybe 5 or 10 years ago, but are happening now. And so I think we just have to forge ahead with those who are willing to engage peacefully and respectfully, as many Gulf states now are.
You mentioned the Abraham Accords. I actually wanted to ask you, often like on the left, we hear that they like to exaggerate Australia's role in the world, like when it comes to, global warming or these type of things that we can impact the world. But one area where we can have an impact is in our region. And there's 3 nations in our region, Muslim majority nations, that Australia has good relations with. I think we even give a lot of aid to some of them, but Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. Is there anything we can be doing to bring the Abraham Accords into this region, to promote ties between Israel and those countries? And I was at an event once a few years ago, and I mentioned this to Maurice Payne, who was there, and she didn't seem very interested. She said her job is to act in Australia's interests and not necessarily to get involved in these type of things. But what are your thoughts on if there's any potential for Australia to play the role of a peacemaker then?
Well, there is actually surprising levels of low-key, low-profile cooperation and engagement between Israel and a number of the countries in our region. And for a range of reasons, many of those countries don't wish to highlight that publicly. But there are very productive conversations taking place between countries in the region and Israel. And I think that's profoundly positive, and there's history here too. When Singapore separated from Malaysia and became a state in its own right, they asked around the world to find someone that would help them to train their military and help them become a sovereign state. And not many countries were willing to offer and to help out, but one country that was Israel. And the IDF was involved very early in training the Singaporean military. In fact, I believe that they were deliberately disguised as if they'd come from Mexico to try and obscure where they're really from. But there are very mature defence and security relationships, intelligence relationships, and growing trade relationships between Israel and the region. And I think that'll be a positive thing for all of us if that continued. That'll be a positive thing for Australia as well as Israel. And so I really hope that does happen.
Right, now to quote Hugh in the UK.
Hello, Senator Paterson. I'm actually an Australian citizen, even though I don't sound necessarily like one, and also a member of AJA. The question I've got, because both Britain and Australia have a common relationship with Israel, although I would suggest that Australia's relationship is much better. But there is a common interest, and I was just going to ask you another question about proscription of a terrorist organization, and that is the PLO. Now, historically, they were a terrorist organization, and in the Oslo Accords, they gave a key undertaking or commitment to abandon terrorism, which they've not done. The Palestinian Authority and the PLO are one and the same, basically. Mahmoud Abbas is head of both of them, and yet he is promoting incitement to terrorism and hatred against the Jewish state and against Jews in general. They haven't abandoned their charter, the PLO. They still aim for the elimination of the Jewish state. What do you think should happen about that? Should the PLO be proscribed as a terrorist organization, which effectively it is?
That's a really good question, Hugh. I haven't studied that question before, and I haven't been briefed on it, but you do make a compelling case. The criteria for listing as a terrorist organisation in Australia involves a couple of different components. Included among those is advocacy of acts of terrorism and financing of acts of terrorism. And I think you could make a pretty good case that the practice of subsidising families of terrorists after they are killed or captured is in effect financing terrorism, even if you weren't able to prove a direct link in directly financing terrorist activities, although maybe you could. And certainly the language coming out of the PLO and its leadership for many years has been extremely violent and advocated terrorism against Israelis. So that probably is something that should be considered.
Thank you.
I need to jump in here because we have been down this track. And let me see if I can bring up. Yeah, you should have on your screen now the summary paragraph of a 10-page opinion we got from former Director of Public Prosecutions of Victoria, Jeremy Rapke. Well, he was then QC. And I'll just read it because we put to him the exact argument that Hugh Kitson just made. And his conclusion was it is strongly arguable that such payments, talking about the Pay for Slay program, incentivise, reward and glorify terrorism when coupled with the public praising of and recognition given to terrorists from a purely evidentiary perspective. Such conduct strengthens the conclusion that the PA intends to encourage terrorism, the conclusion that the PA is a terrorist organisation by reason of it fostering of the doing of a terrorist acts seems almost inevitable. Very unusual for such a senior legal figure to give such clarity. So we have one of the leading legal practitioners who's had the most experience in prosecuting terrorist cases give us that opinion. I have presented it to a number of people in Parliament. If you ever see an opportunity for the matter to be raised again, James, we're very happy to do it.
Thanks, David. That's a really great initiative to have that, what looks like very robust legal advice. It would potentially run into the same issue as the IRGC, but that's just another reason to fix that issue on state prohibition.
Okay. We've got two more questions. I can see someone, Mimi, if you will unmute, because I think I know who that is.
Hi, good evening. I'm Neil.
Neil, I've got to let Senator Paterson know that Neil is an extraordinary person. He's a Syrian refugee who's come to Australia from Iraq. We could do a whole session. We have done a whole session on Neil. He was in the administration of the Syrian Air Force. He was taught anti-Semitism. He was taught evil of Israel. And having made his way to the West, he's done a 180-degree turn when he's had access to information. So we certainly would welcome your question or comment, Neil.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, David. Good evening, James. Just a quick two questions, or it's not questions, it's 2 points. I want to hear it from you, please. First one, James, let me be honest with you. I am a simple man. I'm just came to Australia before 6 years as a refugee, as David says, from Syria. I'm a Christian. I'm not a member of AJA, but I am a deep friend, because I trust what they say. I love what they are doing, and I love their values. So my question is like this, James, if you can hear me. When we ran away from Syria, we ran away with my family through 3 countries, 15 kilometers over the oceans to arrive to the safe of Australia. And suddenly we discovered that there was about 200 fighters from Australia fighting with ISIS there in my country, killing my people there. My question is, where was the security? Where was our national security there? How these people, somebody took them from our streets and sent them there by themselves. Nobody pushed them. And now somebody in this red government with very high IQ, very clever decision, he decided to bring them back again here to our street. We are the Australian taxpayers. We want to pay them to come here again, their children, their wives, their kids, and live with us. Again, can you see this a very good security advice for us? Why I'm doing this? Why I'm paying for this? What I need to talk with my kids about this? What I want to tell. That's my first point. Second point, James, is I think you need to know that we are fighting ideology, not people. And it's totally different between fighting people and fighting ideology. You can shoot or kill somebody who's fighting you, but if there's ideology, you need to use different policy and different strategies to fight that. I hope that you guys there find something, or you have a strategy to do this with this ideology we have, because I think not just the threat is not just from outside, it's also from inside, from Australia. We need to be careful with that. We need a more safe country for my kids, not for me. For me, it's done, but for my kids and my grandchildren. I want them to be safe also here in Australia. And thank you very much for your time.
Neil, so nice to meet you, and thank you for those 2 points, 2 questions, and great to meet you, and great to have you in Australia. And I'm glad that you found safety and freedom here, and that's a wonderful thing. I'm proud our country can provide that for people like you. You make some really great points. Far too many Australians went and fought with ISIS in Syria. We realised too late initially that they were going, and after they did, we started to pass a whole lot of laws to criminalise that conduct. And ASIO, our security organisation, did stop a number leaving, but too many had already gone. And then we faced a very difficult decision about what to do with Australian citizens who were in Syria and survived the war. Many of them died, but those who survived, what to do with them. we, in some cases, stripped their citizenship of those that were dual citizens, and that effectively removed their rights to return to Australia. But there were others whose citizenship couldn't be removed because they weren't a citizen of another country, and you couldn't take away a citizenship if they only had one citizenship. And there were people who were either taken as children or born over there as children who didn't make a choice themselves to come there. Now, the previous government brought some very low-risk young people back home who we judged to be not complicit in any way with the decision to go there and were not involved in fighting. The new government has brought home many more, and in my view, they haven't provided adequate public explanation for why they've chosen to do so, or put in place the resources needed to manage those people here in Australia. They haven't increased funding for ASIO, they haven't increased funding for the Australian Federal Police. They frankly dropped them in on some communities without even consulting or warning those communities first or working with them. And I think that was a very disappointing thing. And they treated those communities with contempt, because Australians are right to be anxious about people who've returned from a war zone, who were at least with Islamic State, if not of Islamic State. And I'd be very concerned if the government chose to bring any more people back without adequately explaining to the Australian people that there's no risk in doing so, and providing resources to our intelligence and security agencies to monitor them if they do pose any risk. So yeah, you make very good points, and I appreciate it. And I completely agree about your point about ideology. That it is a sick ideology in many cases, whether it's Islamism, whether it's authoritarian ideology, communism. This is a sick ideology which infects people and makes them think in dangerous and harmful ways, and that is our enemy. It's not individual people, as you say.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Neil, for your questions and your amazing story as well. I think we've got time for just one more question, so we might go to Jason.
Yeah, good evening, Senator. Quick question for you. Now, it relates to your earlier comment on the slowness of government process, and also the late Senator Molan's book, Danger on Our Doorstep. Now, as you would well know, better than any of us, if the balloon does go up there, it's going to be a very short and nasty war. My favourite politician, with all due respect, is John Curtin, because of his capacity to create a wartime bipartisan cabinet. So my question is very specific. Is there the structural capacity and or the political will to establish a bipartisan wartime cabinet in Australia if things go south in our region? And if so, would that be too little too late?
Really great question. My short answer is not yet, but maybe soon, because I do think the challenges that we face are existential. And I am concerned, like you are, of the frankly peacetime mindset which dominates our thinking about these issues, including even in our defence bureaucracy, who are conducting their normal procurement processes with their long timeframes and not getting into the hands of our people now the weapons that they might need to help defend ourselves and secure our sovereignty. And I am very concerned that that mindset hasn't shifted yet and hasn't changed, and it needs to. Myself and Andrew Hastie and a few other colleagues have already proposed that there be an equivalent to the Intelligence and Security Committee for AUKUS, along the same lines of your thinking, that it would be bipartisan, that it would provide oversight for what is the most important decisions an Australian government will ever make about procuring the most expensive and most consequential equipment we'll ever put in the hands of our people. And that it will provide a continuity, because AUKUS is going to be a baton passing exercise. We initiated the race. We handed the baton to Labor to do the next part because they won the election. At some point within the life of the AUKUS agreement, there will be a coalition government again. And when that happens, I want to make sure whoever takes over that job as Defence Minister, if it's Andrew Hastie or whoever it might be, is fully briefed and fully on top of the decisions that have been made on AUKUS in the meantime. So we've proposed this kind of joint statutory committee on AUKUS to perform the same function that the Intelligence Committee does for the intelligence community. And I really hope the government takes that up. We'll find out potentially in a matter of days what direction they're going in on submarines, and we'll continue to prosecute this issue with them. And I hope they'll demonstrate the bipartisanship that we're offering on this issue.
What have you noticed much of an impact? Well, I mean, obviously big impact, but what's your thoughts on the Biden administration, on the global security situation changes, and what might happen next year if there's a Republican victory? Do you think Biden's played a role in what's going on in the world, Ukraine, Afghanistan, China?
Yeah, look, I mean, if I was in the United States, I'd be a Republican, like probably many of you. And certainly there's lots of things about the Biden administration's domestic agenda that I would have a different opinion on. But by and large, I think they have been quite good on national security and foreign policy. There'd probably be things I would have done differently in that area as well. but I've been actually quite heartened by their China policy in particular. They have not taken any backward steps with the Chinese government, and in fact have taken even further some of the things that Trump put in place. It was Trump who first initiated the trade sanctions against China, but it's the Biden administration which has doubled down on that, particularly in relation to sensitive technologies. I mean, they basically made it a crime to export chips to China, because they recognise the intellectual property that had been stolen from American companies over so many years had given the China an unfair advantage that they didn't want to further exacerbate by selling further chips to them. That was a bold decision to make, and I think the right one and a good one, and I support that. And I think they have played a good leadership role in relation to the invasion of Ukraine. They have rallied the NATO allies and provided more support than probably any of us would have predicted that they would have for the Ukrainians. If I have any kind of criticism at all, it is that the assistance that they end up providing collectively, the Western powers, including NATO, including others like Australia, is months after they said they wouldn't provide it. And the tanks is the best example of this most recently. They said for months, we're not going to provide tanks, we're not going to provide tanks, we're not going to provide tanks. And then they did provide tanks. And I think months of time was wasted in the meantime when these are complex pieces of equipment that people need to be trained on to use that could have been more quickly and more usefully utilised by the Ukrainians earlier. So if we can resolve that issue and get these kind of weapons into the hands of people on the front line in Ukraine quicker, then I think they deserve an A+ for that.
Well, Senator James Paterson, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like this conversation could have gone on a lot longer, a lot more topics, and we'll have to have you back. There's some amazing insights you've provided, and we're obviously expecting big things from you, and hopefully soon, lots of good news coming from you. Thanks everyone for joining us as well. Before we go, just a reminder, we've got the L'chaim show with Maurice Klein is on 3ZZZ. And don't forget, you can keep up with AJA, our Facebook page, our email list, all the social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, everything. But for now, wishing you all a good night. I look forward to seeing you next week, where we've got Ruthie Bloom, who'll be talking about the leftist protests in Israel and what's really going on, providing some perspective. Thanks again, Senator. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.